I'm excited to hear about this. We have Steve Matthews here today. He's with the School of Environment and Natural Resources as the Associate Professor of Wildlife Landscape Ecology. I've heard Steve give this talk several times before, and it's always fascinating. So I hope you enjoy. And I'm going to turn it over now to Steve. So welcome, Steve, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Marty and Kathy. I'm going to cut my video off here in a second, but just wanted to say hi to everyone. And it's really great to take part in this webinar series. Woodland Stewards always does great stuff, so it'll be fun today. So I'm going to cut my video off so that I can share my screen and get going here. So. Okay, all right, and so I'll let Marty and Kathy tell me if the sharing does not work out right. Pause for a second there. I guess it's
looks
working
good.
out. Okay, all right,
yep.
Great. I'm gonna go ahead and jump into it. So yeah, this is a great day outside, obviously, so hopefully everyone will get out into the woods and today. And what I'll be going over today will really be talking about some of the research that we've been doing for quite some time. I can't believe it's almost been about 20 years or so since we've been working on these questions. So it's always fun to talk about, and we'll try to go through some of the newer research that we've been doing over the last couple of years to really kind of address this question. And what I want to do today is really for us to think about, forest, it's focused mostly on birds and climate change, and really why it's important that we're considering climate change impacts across multiple taxa. And this work is really highly collaborative. I have a photo up there at the top there, and so that's Dr. Prasad, Matt Peters, myself, and Louis Iverson with the Forest Service. And we've really been working together, like I said, on these questions for a long time. And it's really been a great collaboration with the Forest Service. And so a lot of what I'll talk about today will be that research and the landscape change research group. I say that's referring to the group. And so when we think about climate change, right, we know that it's happening and we know it's impacting forests in many different ways. And as we continue to move through the next decades, the magnitude will only increase. And so as we think from a forest perspective, coming up with these adaptation strategies will be really important if we want to maintain healthy and productive forests. And the view here and the spin that we'll kind of take with this talk is that, we want to understand both how trees and wildlife are responding to climate change. And that will give us a unique perspective about how those ecosystems are functioning in ways that we can build in some resilience and resistance to those components. So it's really kind of taking this view of thinking of this kind of intersection between wildlife, in this case birds, and trees. And so that takes us to the kind of the focus of a lot of the research. And I'll end by just I'll end this kind of intro, and I'll also end the talk with this really important kind of note about collaboration, especially when we're talking about research around climate change. The things we do now will really be important to the types of forests we have in the future. And so programs like the Woodland Stewards programs, anything that brings folks together, the Day in the Woods programs, to talk about what we understand as research, what land managers are doing on the ground, what the public is thinking about is really critical. So that collaboration is really critical to how we kind of manage and engage in a shared stewardship across Ohio and really across the landscape. So with that, right, I'm just going to briefly just talk about climate change in general. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about necessarily the ways in which the climate has changed, because I think there's enough out there evidence and clear information about how much the climate has already changed to date and how that change will continue. But it's important for us to set up here. So if we just take from the 4th National Climate Assessment, right, across the U.S., right, we get a clear picture, right, that over the last several decades, right, the average annual temperature has increased by a degree Fahrenheit. Right, and that is not equally distributed over the year. And so understanding that variability is really critical, especially when we're going to talk about it in context of trees and birds, because they're responding to different signals. So warmer in the winters, much more so than warmer in the summers to date. But that signal is really strong and clear about the amount of change. The other aspect that I just want to highlight, right, is also it's not just the absolute average change that's important, especially when we think about ecosystems, right? We also have to think about how extremes are changing. So again, from the National Climate Assessment, right, we can see a clear picture of this change in the daily numbers of highs that we've had, right? So this kind of extreme heat in certain time periods, also some cases followed by extreme cold kind of as the atmosphere becomes less stable, right? And so this is really critical because of this kind of increased variability presents novel situations for species. We also have, right, an increase in the number of precipitation events, heavy precipitation events, right? These kind of excessive rain over short periods of time. And those trends have really been persistent over the last several decades. And we have more and more events where we have lots of precipitations in shorter periods of time, followed by more extended periods of drought. And so these conditions, right, are really what drives ecosystem change in many ways. And it's really that cumulative view of not just the climate, but the components of temperature, precipitation, wind, and how it's coming spatially. So to give an example, a few years back, right, we were interested in drought specifically. And so what we had done, and as part of this, was really to say, well, how has drought changed in these two 25-year periods? And we get a sense from this cumulative drought index, which kind of more relates to forest conditions than our traditional kind of Palmer drought severity index, which is really important, relates to crops. But this is a longer term kind of view from it. And we can see in that the more recent 25-year period, right, the greater incidences of drought across the US, especially in the West. And so as part of an assessment that was part of the National Climate Assessment, right, in terms of thinking about drought and its influence, right, this question about how are systems necessarily responding. And so in this case, right, we see this important component, right, when we overlaid areas where there had been high levels of tree mortality at a broad spatial scale, right, we see this kind of alignment of where these locations have been experiencing drought over the last 25 years. And it's not just drought, right? It's also the combination of influences, right? So we can think about outbreaks of pests in combination with drought stress leads to these kind of areas of high forest mortality. And so this is a kind of an indicator of the way in which climate change drives and influences ecosystem change. And so going forward, I just wanted to kind of just talk about that because that's the next stage, right? We kind of have established that the climate is changing. So what is the next decades to the end of the century look like? And so this figure I put here because I think it tells a story in a couple ways. So just to orient everyone, because we're all coming from different places here, right? So the x-axis is really looking at these kind of time periods, right? So it's in decade marks on the x-axis. The y-axis, what that refers to is it's the percent of the climate models, so these more recent generations, CMIT-5 climate models, that are kind of reaching this 2 degrees C, so according to the Paris Accord, climate warming. And so what is interesting from this figure, right, if we look at the global component under the kind of moderate emission scenario, 2050-50 is where I would expect to have 50% of those climate models saying we'd reach these 2 degrees C warmings. Whereas under the higher emission scenario, kind of current standards of emissions, right, that occurs at 2043. What I want to point out here is if you look at the CONUS or just focus on the north or the eastern US, that kind of time period is shifted much sooner, right, to really about the time periods of the 2030. So really only a decade away, when half of those climate models are suggesting that we will have that 2 degrees C warming. As a sidebar, what does that look like by the end of the century? If we just focus on the eastern US, this translates to under a moderate amount of warming, of increase of 2.3 degrees Celsius, or right under the higher emissions, that's 5.4 degrees Celsius, which translated in Fahrenheit to about almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. So those are the ways in which we think about how the climate has changed in this kind of accelerating rate we would expect going through the rest of the century. To provide a little additional context about how we think about the climate is changing over the next several decades, we also want to summarize ways in which we can think about some of these key climate indices that give us a picture of what sorts of stress additional climate change may place the plants and wildlife and make uncomfortable for people as well. So, so in this case, we're looking at things like growing degree days and heat zones and plant hardiness zones to get a sense for how these climate picture across the US is suggesting to look. And we'll use that to complement our species models here in a bit. But I think it also gives us a picture to start thinking about the ways in which precipitation, temperature interact to create these novel conditions. So this is again, this figure of a cumulative drought severity index. And what I wanted to show here is over much of the US, right, this idea of droughts intensifying even more so than they are today in that second half of the century. And even in places like Ohio, where we're projected to have more precipitation, there is this likelihood of increasing of drought, in part because of the timing in which precipitation events would likely be coming. So that the redder areas on the bottom figure there, right, indicates areas where longer periods of drought. So look at another way, right, we can think about heat zones, so days over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And what I've done here is just kind of broken this up into 1 by 1 degree grid cells to give us a different look. And we can get a sense for how those number of days over 86 degrees Fahrenheit is likely is projected to increase by the end of the century. So the advantage of breaking it into 1 by 1 degree cells here is that we can actually take a look and get a sense for what that means. So each of these kind of blocks in the numbers in there represents the number of days that are over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the bottom there under the 2 emissions pathways. And you can kind of pick your favorite cell if you want out of that. And that's kind of a nice thing about kind of breaking into this. We can summarize it more locally. But in some cases, right, this is a potential increase in those number of warm days, right, from 40 up to 90 or more days where we'd expect to have those temperatures, which is really not only uncomfortable for plants, but uncomfortable for people as well. And so this brings me to this kind of component where I want to shift and really focus about what this means for forest ecosystems. This is a recent paper from June that I like the illustration because it really gets at this piece that, you know, the climate change along with these other drivers are really important as we consider how forest ecosystems have changed and will continue to change. And it's really this multiplicative effect, right? So if we think about constant risk of forest loss, insect invasion, changes in fire regimes, increase in drought, right? If that's a constant risk, those forests have a chance to adapt and respond and continue to grow. Unfortunately, the era we're in is really those risks are multiplicative. They depend on each other, but they also come at a more intensity as they are combined. So as we move through time, in the bottom figure there, the authors are kind of relaying this kind of as we move through these risks are no longer constant, but they increase. And that multiplication of those pieces results in a very different forest ecosystems by the end of the century. So understanding that, we can start to think about how important understanding forest dynamics is. And by taking that view, we can have a picture of how this creates these potential for novel forest ecosystems and novel conditions as we move through the century. So this is another figure from this year that kind of looks at forest dynamics. And what it says to me is if you take in these, if the authors were looking at these demographic drivers of forest dynamics and understanding how land cover changes in wildfires, changes in insect pests, how that has the potential to shift us into these novel forest ecosystems. And we know many wildlife are adapted to specific forest conditions. And so as they change, that changes the whole habitat dimension for wildlife. And so thinking about these, right, we have this appreciation for really these are all linked, and understanding how forest change will be critical to understanding how wildlife can respond to climate change as well. And wildlife, right, specifically birds, are not necessarily static, right? Their distributions are already changing due to many other drivers. So any of you all that saw the recent paper by Rosenberg and others, right, this estimate of 3 billion birds lost since the 70s by drivers of many different components of habitat loss and other dimensions. And so this idea that, you know, wildlife and birds are already changing their abundance and distribution is critical to current conservation to maintain and stabilize those. But thinking forward into the future is what we're going to do today, is how critical it is to understand understanding of creating and maintaining healthy forest habitat. So just looking from their work at thinking about forest guilds that they looked at. One interesting thing is really all of those different forest guilds are projected to have declines, more than 50% of the species to have declines, really in all except for that really broad generalist forest community, forest bird type community. So this pressure on for forest birds is already exerting in terms of losses of population. And so as we think about how climate change will begin to unfold, right, this gives us more concern that we have to consider how we're managing forests that'll benefit wildlife as well. And climate change poses unique challenges to birds over forests, right? We can think about the many different ways in which birds respond to climate change. We can go back to the really classic work of Terry Root in the 80s that really kind of identified these kind of isoclines and limits, right, we see within the winter distributions of species, like the eastern phoebe. So right, this relates to this kind of basic metabolic processes, right? It gets too cold for some species to make it further north. It becomes too costly, right? And we can see how that kind of plays out with kind of more modern views that look at climate limits, right? In terms of the Audubon's surviving by degree days. It's the same concept that there are these fundamental metabolic processes that limit where species occur. Another way to consider this on the other end of the spectrum is also heat stress, and the way in which that can have impacts on bird populations. So this paper is a really nice example that kind of characterizes as how extreme or increasing heats can really put additional stress on bird populations. So it's more characterized out west, but the figure really kind of captures these different emission scenarios going forward. So a 1.8 degrees C increase up to a 3.7 degree increase. And then the y-axis on that figure is really this kind of proportional increase in cooling costs. So as we think about those temperatures become warmer, birds have to spend more time, more energy trying to stay cool, because we've seen in many cases, right, whereas temperatures reach these critical numbers, right, we can see massive losses locally in terms of populations, in terms of mortalities, right? So there's a limit, right, that birds are trying to balance, and climate change kind of disrupts and forces them to spend more time thinking about maintaining these metabolic processes. Another important component with birds that is very different from trees, right, is this idea that we have to consider not only what's happening in one location, but what's happening throughout their annual cycle. This is a really great figure the folks put together that really kind of characterizes really quickly some of the important components of a full annual cycle and considering climate change. So it's not just are the breeding grounds productive in terms of climate and precipitation and vegetation, but also how is climate change impacting migratory stopover in terms of the extreme weather component. Does that put additional strain and stress? Also in terms of wintering ground, as some of the tropical regions dry and change in precipitation pattern, that puts additional stress on their abilities to maintain in good condition over winter. And there was a relatively recent paper that relates nice to this in terms of thinking about climate vulnerability in the wintering grounds by Leo Culpin and others, that really kind of identifies for lots of the birds breeding in our Great Lakes kind of eco regions, most of those birds are wintering in Mexico and Central America, right? So they're experiencing how those changing forest conditions, changing climate conditions are influencing. So we have to think about what's happening not only here on the breeding grounds, but what's happening on the wintering grounds when we think about climate change impacts for birds. And the last piece that I want to just drive home, and it also relates back to the idea of how plants and birds are interacting, is this component of phenological change, right? We see evidence from across the globe of birds arriving earlier for migration, hatching earlier, fledgling earlier. There's a great study from Powdermill and Holly McDermott led that really kind of documents kind of the earlier emergence of juveniles over these long-term 45-year banding records, right? That's an indicator that species are responding. The challenge that we see And this is really kind of how this times up with when resources are available for species to these high demand resource times, like during the nesting season. We often think about the phenological importance of the caterpillar emergence so that birds can feed their young those high protein components. But as climate changes, the ability for plants to flower earlier, invertebrates to respond to that relatively closely, but a lag in terms of the ability for birds to respond. So this figure is a bit complicated, but it really kind of captures kind of the kind of understanding of how this process works in Europe. And this, I like it because it really kind of has the blue primary producers, so you can think of plants, their ability to shift earlier in response to changing climate, so sensitivity, so earlier being negative, right? They're able to flower earlier. The primary consumers, so Lepidoptera, are able to respond to that change and take advantage of that shift. But the secondary consumers, in this case birds, are not able to shift as much, so they miss that important critical peak in abundance of caterpillars. And I see this across Europe and not so much in North America at this point. And that has a lot to do with the really diverse plant communities we have in Eastern North America, but also the diverse invertebrate communities that we have. So there's other resources that birds can receive, but it's an issue that will continue to intensify as climate changes. And so when we think about this, right, when we think about focusing on forest birds in Eastern US, we know that the diverse kind of community of birds really relates to different types of forest conditions. And it's complex in its dynamics in terms of the types of tree species that are present, but also the structural components. And so as we think about climate change going forward, understanding how these impacts on both trees and birds will be important to understand. While they're different, right, in terms of the way they respond, you know, trees can't up and fly if like birds can, they're really still very linked in terms of space, in terms of the types of habitat we need. We have environmental conditions, right? The plant species that are there are driven by those environmental conditions, right? Those in turn influence the types of bird communities that we have, forest bird communities. So this idea of maintaining structure in healthy forests is really important as we think about how climate change will unfold in terms of spatially and temporally going forward. And so to do that, right, we need tools. And so one of the tools that we've been working on and developing has been our climate change tree and bird atlas that we've had going for quite some time, right, where we're looking at over 130 tree species and 130 bird species. And we want to understand what is influencing these species and where they're currently distributed, and how might climate change those habitats going forward. And so what I want to just talk a little bit about are just some of the general outputs that we have for all of those species, right? And the types of insight that we can gain. You know, for some species, like for the trees, we not only consider climate conditions, but we also know that soil characteristics, soil types, elevation are all also really important in determining how species find their habitat in the landscape. And we can model that under current conditions and then project how it would change under different habitat components. So I'm showing two species of southern oaks here just to in part drive into home an example. Both these species would show projections of increases in habitat towards the end of the century. But we know with trees, right, it's really not possible for them to colonize all these areas. So it's important that we consider that dispersal process within, as we think about how trees can occupy habitats going forward. And so what we have done, right, and this is really led by Prasad, is really trying to understand how that habitat quality going forward, how conditions may change for tree species, and then what is the likelihood that they would actually be able to colonize that over the next 100 years. And so this is work where we are actually able to collaborate with Canada Forest Service, so working with our colleagues both in the US and Canada to finally be able to model across borders and really to gain an important picture of how species are distributed across their full range. And so in this case, I'm just showing for white pine, those areas in tan are areas that, yes, the species likely have suitable habitat by the end of the century, but it's going to be very challenging for it to actually colonize those regions. So it gives us a much clearer picture of the limits of the suitable habitat that may be colonized by the end of the century. For birds, right, an important aspect that we have in our models is we consider the climate conditions that are currently influencing bird species, but we also consider those individual tree species. And that gives us a unique view on the types of habitat conditions that birds are associated with as they specifically relate to trees. So for species like prothonotary warblers, sure, precipitation is an important predictor variable, but we also see some of those bottomland oaks and other bottomland species as really being kind of strongly associated with those types of habitat. And then we can project how those may change. So a potential increase in habitat for prothonotary warblers, potential decline in habitat, especially in the quality of that habitat for things like black-capped chickadee. And we can look at this across species and start to understand how these patterns will emerge. And we'll get to that in a bit when we come to application. But just to illustrate the importance that the tree information has in our understanding of how birds may respond to climate change, I just wanted to kind of do this little illustration here. And what I have here is an example for a black-throated blue warbler, right? We have our current kind of habitat condition where it's distributed across the eastern United States. And then traditionally what we would do is we would say, okay, well, how much habitat is available for it towards the end of the century? And that would essentially be a ratio. In this case, potential loss of about half of its habitat by the end of that century. And so that would be the way in which we'd characterize whether species have potential to increase or decline in habitat. But one important component to this is how does it get from point A to point B? And so what we have been doing now is considering how do those habitats suitability change over these decadal time periods to give us a picture of the trajectory of that habitat change. And by doing that, we can start asking questions about how important are those particular combinations of tree information and variables in the model. And what does it mean if we were not to have that level of information, or if tree species were changing at different time periods? And so the first question we'd ask, and we've asked this question before in our earlier papers around this, was how important is that climate information? And so what I have here is this figure. So the black kind of line and dots represents our understanding of how habitat would change by using both climate and tree information. So potential of 32% decline in habitat for black-throated blue warbler. If we just use climate information and excluded the information from trees, right, we have a projection of decline of about 65% of habitat. So it really kind of illustrates the important kind of dimension that what's happening on the ground for forest birds is really critical as we think about climate change influencing those species. And what we also then are able to do is kind of think about different scenarios. So this is really the same kind of the black and red figure here in terms of with only climate variables, with a full suite of trees there. And then we add an additional scenario into play here. And here what we're thinking about, what happens if we are able to influence forest management and forest conditions and the types of trees that are available to the species, and those don't change, right? So we're setting up a scenario of the modeling only with climate. We're thinking about the climate changes along with forest change, right? And we're thinking about if climate changes without forest change. So we're able to maintain those habitat conditions. And we see a great reduction in potential loss of habitat for black-throated blue warbler, right? And so this gives us this idea to think about how change occurs over time, right? If that's a really fast decay in habitat loss, or is it slower and gradual? And it gives us an additional kind of evidence of the importance that tree information has with our understanding of how birds may respond to climate change, because it's really not just the climate, it's that interaction with the types of habitat. And so what I have here is a suite of species, and this is really just to kind of depict a gradient of how we think of birds responding to climate change and their habitat loss. I'll start by just kind of mentioning, this is a gradient across 88 forest species. So on one end, the black-billed cuckoo, you can see those lines all are close together. So what does that mean? Well, that means that model and that species, right, is really responding more to the projected changes in climate than the types and specific combinations of tree species. So regardless, we have a potential for loss in habitat. Black and white warbler is kind of an intermediate level. The types of forest are a bit more generalist. We think about how it's distributed within Ohio, right? It's kind of a generalist kind of forest type species. And so considering that it can take advantage of many different forest conditions, right? Its habitat can be relatively stable under climate change potentially, if we can maintain those forest conditions. Whereas the black-throated blue warbler has those specific combinations of tree species that are important to it. So we can think about the importance of it kind of having dense understory and being able to have nests in striped maple and things like that in the Northeast, right? Those are very specific components of the types of trees are important. So it gets at this picture that birds and trees are linked, especially as we think about climate change impacts and changes to their habitats. So that was a lot. All right, everyone take a deep breath. That's 30 minutes in. Whew. All right. So what I want to talk about now is I want to talk about how these data from the Climate Change Tree and Bird Atlas are being used. And to do that, I really have to acknowledge the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences. This is a group that we work a lot with and are part of. So they're a Forest Service NRS 06, but it's also a collaboration with universities, nonprofits, tribal organizations, conservation organizations that really think about climate adaptation. And there's three different ways in which the Atlas information kind of feeds into getting information out on the ground to influence and hopefully to help inform how we think about climate change impacting our forest ecosystems. The first one would be this idea of combined species output. I showed a lot of things that were just individual species. This species might increase, the species might decline in habitat. But to understand what's going or how that change will kind of unfold, we have to think about how is that in combination with other species. And so what we have done, right, is the idea of this combined species component. So one of Lewis's, one of our recent papers that Lewis led was really kind of trying to bring some new thoughts to how we can enable these products to be more accessible to managers and interested folks about how changes in tree species may occur in a particular area. So how those habitats may change. So this is just a figure in these 1x1 degree blocks of the number of oak species that are located within these blocks. That's just an example. But really within each of these cells is a whole host of information that we can then think about to be more spatially explicit about how climate change may impact forests within these regions. We can also get an appreciation for the types of changes that may occur. So on the left here, we have the number of species that have less capability to cope with climate change. When I say capability, that incorporates both potential changes in habitat, but also certain adaptability traits, so individual species traits. How drought tolerant is it? How can it compete with light? Right, all these pieces that aren't necessarily in our habitat models, but are really important to thinking of how adaptable species will be to climate change. And so we can see across the central portion of the East, especially into the Southeast, right, that's a large number of species, 20s or so number of species that have potential to kind of have poor capability to cope with climate change. And the figure on the right is the other side of the picture, right? So those blues are areas of the teens to 20s that have, or species have this potential to migrate over the next 100 years. So if you think about that, our ability to consider colonization likelihood of trees over the next 100 years, over 3 or 4 generations, right? Those are areas that have the potential to gain. And what that also means is those are also the areas that have potential to transition in the types of forest ecosystems that they have. So it gives us this perspective of how habitat losses and potential new colonizations could play out. So it's important dimension to that. And the next component I want to talk about is really the climate change response framework that NIACS has developed. And many of you all are likely familiar with some of the different ways in which this has been implemented. The Central Appalachians, I'll talk a bit more coming up, but there's also been more localized ones. The LEAP program, Lake Erie, is another example where these kind of vulnerability assessments have been developed. And they're really developed in collaboration with many people involved, but essentially a way to focus on different ecoregions, different locations, and thinking about how forests in those regions are maybe impacted by climate change. So it's a nice way to think about and bring people together to talk about climate change and what sorts of actions can be done now to maintain healthy, productive forests. Another nice aspect about these the climate change response framework are these hundreds of demonstration sites across the eastern U.S. And this figures a couple years old, and there's more even today, a couple more in Ohio, I will note, that really kind of go on the ground and say our understanding of how trees may respond to climate change, what kind of actions on the ground can be done to demonstrate adaptation principles to think about making those forests more resilient to climate change. And I'll just give one example, right? There's a whole, embedded within this is a really, really nice kind of project led by Lynn and Ecol and many others, Colorado State and many others, of this idea of adaptive silviculture for climate change. And in this, right, is this kind of this understanding of how do we think about how silviculture, how forest management can play in making those forests more resistant to climate change. So we have this component of resistance, resilience, and transition in terms of types of actions that can be implemented now for those forests. So in a resistance case, right, really kind of maintaining the current types of forest conditions. And these are all kind of, in many cases in the East, we can utilize the tree atlas information to make that determination, right? Are there habitats or those main species likely to persist within those landscapes? In this case, a resistance strategy to make sure those forests are healthy. Are we in a place that is more in a resilience type of framework? So there's going to be trying to maintain those species, but encouraging species that may be present there, but they're not the dominant conditions, right? So this idea of encouraging of the types of plants that may be able to grow there into the future, so we can have that forest that's going to be more resilient to climate change. And the third component, right, or if we're in these cases of transitions, and this is kind of facilitating and encouraging change. A classic example of transition type planning may be in areas where emerald ash borer has come through, right? As those ash trees die off, what is that next generation or two of forest going to look like? And what kind of trees are going to be more suitable under a future climate? And so it's a way of considering of reducing climate change impacts and maintaining the types of conditions of those forests. And so a really great example and demonstration site and one of these ask site, it really is in the Cutfoot Experimental Forest in the Chippewa National Forest. And it really is a great way of seeing how this all kind of plays out on the ground. And so this study was really one of the first ask sites. And you can see they really have a really great replicated study where they have these different stands that are assigned to these different treatments, essentially, whether it's a resistance treatment, or resilience treatment, or transition location, and then monitor and then actively plant and manage those forests for those types of conditions, and then monitor them. And so it's a place where they actually have 3 years of studies. This paper just came out last year that they did. That kind of characterizes that. And I want to spend just a second here. I know it's a big table on a webinar, so that's like, I know that's not always fun, but I think it's important that we think about what this table is saying. And so I want to say a few words about it. So what we can see here is when they were kind of deciding on the trees to plant, many of them above the red line, right, were informed by climate change atlas in terms of species that would have suitable habitat throughout the century. Some of those tree species, right, were currently established there and important members of the community, right, like red maple and eastern white pine. Other species, right, may be present within the area, but they're relatively infrequent in the Cutfoot Experimental Forest at this time, but they're projected to have suitable habitat towards as we move through the century. So things like black cherry and bitternut hickory. And other species really don't necessarily occur on those locations, right? But their habitat models would suggest that they would be suitable to grow there. And so then they went out and actually did this. And the last species was ponderosa pine to really emulate an economically important species within the area that may replace some of the current species that have potential to decline. And so what they found is just over 3 years, so not a long time, right? But they found this kind of really interesting pattern that those species, right, from the east that are either there or projected to have suitable habitat there, right, they all have relatively high survival over the last 3 years, right, in the 90%, 95% in many cases, especially even some of those species that are kind of relatively infrequent in the Cuttlefoot. What they found was the ponderosa pine really had this really low survival in really all of those types of stands, right? Indicating, you know, its ability to grow now is certainly very impaired in many ways. And so it kind of gets to this idea of thinking about how silviculture can kind of come into play into thinking and understanding of how climate change impact these forests, what we can do now in order to increase forest conditions now to have them available when those climate suitabilities become present. So it's a really interesting study and a great example of a site that's kind of actively using some of this atlas data. And so the last piece I want to talk about is this idea of these vulnerability assessments. And I know that some on the line likely are involved in the Central Appalachians vulnerability assessment. And so it's really kind of targeted for land managers and really thinking about forest ecosystems and bringing community together to consider climate change impacts and then to identify vulnerability of different forest stands within a given region. So the one relevant, there's two relevant obviously to us, but the one I'll talk about is the Central Appalachian region. This is led by Patricia Leopold a while ago, and this is a more recent kind of handout from that, in which the group would come together, kind of consider the evidence of climate change, consider how tree species habitats may change, think about those species that may be potentially declining in habitat, maybe increasing in habitat, and then essentially consider vulnerability of those major forest ecosystem types. And one of the conclusions from that initial work was really this kind of dry oak and oak pine forest woodlands, right, had relatively low vulnerability to climate change, in part because, right, they have traits, conditions that can deal with kind of increase in drought and other components. But the problem is, right, is this challenge of regeneration. And so in order to realize those suitabilities of habitats, we have to understand how we can get those forests growing and regenerating. So it's a really great example of a collaboration of folks coming together to consider climate change across a broad area. And so just to say about oak, because I think it's important, again, right, if we think about the Eastern US, you know, oak makes up an important portion of a lot of those forests. In many cases, right, the growing kind of stock is heavily dominated by oaks across the east portions of the Eastern US, especially in places like Southeast Ohio. And this idea that it also kind of captures many different types of conditions. We can go down to the bottomland oaks in the Southeast and in other areas. We can go to the really dry ridges and oaks we have here, right? So kind of an important kind of diversity of ecosystems that we think about. And then what we also think about, right, is the challenges we have regeneration across the Eastern US and our forests. And so it's interesting, these two papers, they both use forest inventory analysis data, but they took a different approach. And they really kind of highlight spatially the challenges we have with regeneration across the Eastern US. And the drivers of those changes, right, are things like invasives and disease and development, changes in disturbance regimes, but they kind of highlight the challenges we have with regeneration across the Eastern US, especially the Northeast. So the one figure by Vickers kind of illustrates this idea that yes, the forests likely would maintain as forests, but this idea that they're primed for a stand replacement in terms of the secure probability of replacing with some type of forest. So it can shift, right? And that's what we see with the processes of mesification as we shift from more oak hickory type forests towards more beech and maple type conditions, right? Those conditions are more amenable for them due to lack of disturbance. And the other figure here from Miller and McGill has a really interesting take on it and thinking about this regeneration debt severity. So this in places that have this regeneration debt where the types of trees growing are very different than the types of trees in the overstory. And they really highlight this importance of understanding how current forest management, will shape those future conditions. And we can add in that layer of climate change now that we have an understanding of how climate change may impact these species. And so, of course, the oak regeneration problem, right? We've had webinars and seminars about these, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but what I want to illustrate, here is this idea of this, especially within Ohio and other regions, this kind of limited oak regeneration and recruitment. So though these species may be suitable under climate conditions in the future, we don't have that growing conditions now. And so this is driven by, right, this changes in lack of disturbance, right, loss of fire, changes in shade tolerance conditions that drives that process of vesification. And so these studies, like at Wittenfurnace Experimental Forest and other places, that really focus on these kind of silvicultural treatments to enhance oak regeneration and having oak stay competitive on given forest landscape types. It's going to be critical to making sure that these conditions are available as we move into an era of more accelerated climate change. And so that's where we kind of can bring back this component of birds, and that there's a strong link, right, between forest management and creating bird habitat. We see it in many different plans where both the indicators of forest as well as the objectives, right, are often focused on wildlife objectives. And so we can think of taking that information and applying it to our perspective of climate change responses. So in Ohio, the Forest Manager's Guide is really focused on that. And then the very new, right, off the presses this year, the Managing Guide for Small Forest Patches is another great example where we can think about these types of strategies for maintaining healthy forests for birds. And other states have great programs as well, and it links this idea of forest and active management to promoting diversity of birds. And so with that in mind, right, what we can go back to is revisit this Central Appalachian assessment for climate change, right? We have a sense for how trees may respond to those. We can think about, right, this would be a figure of the different trees and the types of habitats they have and the potential changes. So species like, sugar maple have potential to declines in the region and so on and so forth. We can then apply that same logic to the types of birds we've modeled in our climate change bird atlas. And what is interesting, if we look at the Forest Manager's Guide, we actually have we actually have 26 of the 32 focal species that are identified in the Forest Bird Guide in terms of either highest priority or the moderate priority. And we can look at how habitats under climate change and these emission scenarios may respond. And we can see that for many species, the red areas being the decline of at least 20% of habitat within that kind of focal Central Appalachian region. For many of those species that are highest and high priority species, with a few species, smaller percentage of the species have the potential to increase in habitat. So it really is kind of drives home this important that maintaining priority species habitat, we have to consider about what's available currently, but also what the future availability of that habitat will look like, and what can we do to ensure that these priority species will have that habitat going into the next decades. And so I just want to give you a couple of quick examples from that. And so I really like these diagrams from the Massachusetts Audubon kind of foresters for birds kind of components. So I'm going to use those to be more kind of mesic type species. I could have used worm-eating warbler because we know that species is heavily dependent on oaks, but I like this figure. And just to illustrate that for some species, like the wood thrush, we have, kind of these stable populations of wood thrush in Ohio, a really important component because many other portions of the range are declining. But going forward under climate change, right, we'd expect in the Central Appalachian regions for that habitat to decline by 25 to almost 50% within the area. And that has a lot to do with this change in potential of mixed mesic woods in terms of maples and other types of conditions. Another example would be Veery. We're at the very southern end of its current distribution. And so under climate change, we would expect that habitat to even further retract and only have about 25% remaining of habitat. And this has a lot to do, again, with the climate conditions, but also the changes in types of forest variables that would be present and suitable for viewing. And the last one is an earlier successional type species. Again, it's projected to decline less, right? It's currently very abundant, but under the higher emission scenario, there's a pretty large potential decline in habitat in the central Appalachian regions. And this is an important species, right, as we think about the importance of having early successional habitat on the landscape, but also those kind of regenerating type forests, you know, this kind of association with the yellow poplar at the distributional extent kind of really is emblematic of those shade intolerant types of conditions that we find eastern towhees in southeast Ohio, right? So these are all examples of the way in which we can think about birds responding to climate change, but also how forest management influences these bird conditions, these bird habitats now. And so that brings me to kind of the end of the talk here in the last 10 minutes. And I want to just focus a bit more on southeast Ohio, because a lot of what I've talked about now have really been pretty coarse scale. And really our models are meant to do that, right? They're more macro view of how habitats for trees and birds looks across the eastern US. And to drill down to a finer scale, maybe to a more management relevant scale, we have to use other data. And luckily, Southeast Ohio is a great place for that. With the Shared Stewardship Program and in collaboration with the Division of Forestry, the Wayne National Forest, NRCS, and many other people involved, right, it's provided that opportunity to, one, collect data across this region, but also to evaluate how those forests are changing and to think about how bird habitats are maintained within this kind of large 17 county area. So we have been working on lots of different ways of thinking about quantifying these components. And what I want to say additionally is we can use that information, right, and then create a really fine scale kind of understanding of forest types. In one of our recent papers that Bryce Adams did, who's now a research silviculturist at the Northern Research Station in Delaware, was really to kind of develop this gradient map of forest type conditions, right? So the gradient map really kind of captures the diverse forest species we have in Southeast Ohio and how those changes over a very dissected landscape of ridges and valleys. And combining that to develop new maps of forest types and how those kind of situate in the landscapes in places that would be more suitable for oak regeneration and the like. So it's kind of giving this fine scale wall-to-wall view of Southeast Ohio. And if we have that fine scale view, right, we also in the same area, right, have this detailed understanding that the important kind of links that we have between floristic composition, so the plant community, and for birds. So I know this figure is a lot to look at, but the second bullet there summarizes it. So in Ohio, Bryce Adams found that the forest bird community had this really closer correspondence with the plant species than the structure alone. So the types of trees are really critical to the types of bird species we have present in Southeast Ohio. So this understanding of this linking between forest and trees persists both at this local scale as well as the broader scale we've been modeling climate change at. And so really when birds are, again, stressing that often indicators of forest conditions and forest management goals, we can start to think about how this finer scale information intersects with our understanding of climate change habitats. And so one thing that we're currently working on is this ability to spatially look at this potential risk and opportunities to think about management for climate change for tree species at a relatively fine scale. So if we take 39 tree species, and this is the Athens district of the Wayne National Forest, right, we can think about what are those potential changes in habitat under climate change. So those models I've been talking about, we can match that with our fine scale understanding of forest types and plant communities. We can then identify, how much shifting potentially can occur, right, on this really dissected landscape. So in areas in blue, kind of this decreasing distance would be areas that have more opportunity, right? More places where climate change, we can think about managing to support those species, and then risk areas where some change in the tree species community is likely under climate change. We can summarize this at that ecological land type or forest type to get a picture of what types of impacts climate change may have at this finer scale. But of course, it's all dependent on the actions and understanding and knowledge that people have at these local scales to what is actually feasible to address these climate change pieces. And so with that, I'm going to end here in my last slide here, but just to bring it all back, and this importance of thinking about, how climate change is influencing forests and forest birds. This idea that the Eastern US is really critical location to consider climate change. I always like this figure from Josh Lawler's group out of Washington that kind of gets at this kind of pace and flow of climate change response. And we see, this kind of large funneling through the Appalachians. So we have an important position in terms of maintaining connectivity for species to be able to respond and change to an ongoing environmental change. We have to consider both these near-term and long-term processes. What can we do now to make sure that forests are healthy and regenerating so they can be more resilient, resistant to climate change down the road? And ultimately, silviculture really matters. If we want to do this, we can consider climate change, both forest and wildlife, to be more informed. And my last point, again, I told I was going to end on this, is this idea, we're creating these diverse forest structures is really important, these adaptation strategies. And really to do that, right, it takes collaboration, which is really, I feel really fortunate, within Ohio, within Southeast Ohio, all the great collaborations that are there in terms of trying to get this work done on the ground. So with that, I'll say thank you. There's too many collaborators to really say. Some of the folks who contributed to some of the papers presented here today, and I'll be happy to take some questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. My brain is just like so full with all that information. So really, really cool. I'll note really quickly before we go to questions that I did put a few websites that, for publications and items that Steve referred to. So I put the climate and tree atlas link in the chat box. I also put the Massachusetts Audubon bird guide in there because, yeah, those figures were great. And I had to go search those out right away. And then I also put in a link to the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, who's the leader in really getting those Ohio bird guides going that Steve referred to. So those are in the chat box. So we do have some questions coming in. The first two are more comments. Adam Komar, I think he's outlined your future research objectives, Steve.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, so he said, it would be interesting to see someone study the changing distribution of bird dispersed woody plant species in relation to the changing distribution of bird ranges in relation to climate change, which, yes, I agree, that would be very interesting.
It's awesome. And I will just put a plug in for one of our current graduate students, Jay Wright, who's working with Chris Tanra and myself, and he's really understanding the important mutualisms between oaks and blue jays, oaks and chestnuts and blue jays. And so he's actually putting tags in nuts and seeing how far they're getting dispersed by blue jays. So I think that you're right on. It's an important topic that we need to study to understand more. So great.
He also said it would be interesting to see somebody research how the phenological changes of plants affect insect community distribution and abundance. And yep.
Yeah, there's some really great stuff out there. There's a recent paper, I didn't mention it, by Jim Clark's group and Proceeding the National Academy of Science that really it's really a neat view at how these food webs have changed in terms of forest phenology. I can get that link too. So some really cool stuff and really great ideas. So thanks for the questions and comments. So.
Reese is asking, can you recommend one reference that would show what species to plant in northeastern Ohio for the future to replace some of those species that are in decline, from pest disease and climate change?
Yeah, so one site, I would say the Atlas site has, what we try to do there in those combined species output for every 1 by 1 degree grid, and has like the lat and long so you can find your spot, right? It kind of gives you a table of species in terms of their potential habitats. It's both a PDF or Excel table. It gives potential changes, but it also gives ideas of species that have potential ability to grow there potentially in the future in terms of habitat conditions. And And it kind of tries to relate that to thinking about that. But I will say it's really all in something we think about, it's local knowledge is really being critical because they're relatively coarse in their view. So you know your landscape better in terms of what side of a ridge it sits or bottomland, and that's going to be really critical in making those decisions. So they're just kind of ways to get that list of the types of habitats, and then that local information really is important. But I also will say, what region was that again? I'm sorry, that was the
that was Northeast.
Yeah, so we did with the LEAP group, Lake Erie Allegheny Plateau. Please tell me I got that right. Partnership. Yeah, thank you. So we did do a summary for we were part of one of those kind of components about climate change, and I know on their site the climate change piece has a more specific list. That's another place to look. And I guess my other component is related to like as species move through. I mean, disease and pests come through. I mean, we did do another paper related to more emerald ash borer kind of planting replacement for that, and that is more focused on those bottomland type species, especially as moved towards Minnesota and other areas. But it really tries to get the idea that these forests have changed dramatically already, and so they're more in this transition type of a state of climate change adaptation. Sorry for the long answer there. That's just yeah.
Well, and this is kind of along those same lines. Kathleen asks, as we are madly planting trees with volunteer groups, especially along streams, what changes do we need to do now? So maybe you already answered that, but
yeah, but no, I think that's part of it. I mean, it's this balance of what can grow and out compete now, right? To deal with invasives and other aspects. But also be well positioned going forward. And I think it's really that kind of understanding of the material that is available. So example, like the elms are a good example of species that likely would figuring out the ability to Dutch elm resistant elms in some cases, right? That's a species under climate change that would likely have the conditions suitable for it if we can figure out how to keep them alive, right? So on a climate change, that those pieces come into play. So I think that's how you can use information from the atlas.
Right. Great. Just another thought from someone. They said, we need diversity in trees to provide habitat and food resources to the different life forms in the environment. Without our rainforest to cool and clean the air, water, the temperature accelerates, trade winds move faster to create that heating effect on the earth. This changes the way trees respond, as well as pests and diseases and how they move. And so just basically saying we really need to work hard to protect our forest and plant regeneration every year. So very true.
And definitely that, diversity of, in the Eastern US, everywhere, rainforest as well. But I've always been really amazed, in Ohio, the plant, tree species diversity we have and the bird species diversity we have and the different types of things we have to do, to make sure that they're present because, so many species have those associations. And so that's what's nice about this program and others is, the get across the state and see those diversity of conditions to appreciate that message that come through the same.
Great. Okay, so Marie says, hi Steve, for urban or suburban tree plantings in Northeast Ohio, where we are trying to plant 10 to 20 to even 50 trees, are there any trees that stand out as key species to plant? Any trees you definitely avoid planting due to their lack of climate resiliency?
Yeah, so that's a great one. And it's also an area that's pretty active in terms of things we're thinking about, too. So in addition to thinking about responses in this kind of intersection between birds and trees, we have stuff going on in Columbus right now with the Forest Service. We're trying to understand that relationships, but also the folks at the NIACS have really been focusing a lot on urban forests. And so I gave a talk at the Partners Community Forest last year that was in Cleveland in collaboration with Leslie Brandt, who's really kind of leading a lot of the urban adaptation pieces. And what I will say is that urban areas are unique, right, in terms of types of conditions dealing with, and that understanding is really, really critical. So some of the things we think about adaptation or adaptive traits that species have that we evaluate, I think you need to think about other ones in urban areas, right? You know, in terms of that are going to be really critical. So I can't say like rattle off a list of species right now, but I do know that we have some of those tables. We have done some work with the Chicago wilderness piece in terms of types of trees that would be suitable there. And I'd be happy to talk more with you, but also put you in contact with Leslie, because she's working a lot in the Twin Cities and as far as Austin in terms of urban planning, how it intersects with climate change and tree planting specifically. So it's a great question. And I think it's one we're trying to figure out. I will add that we just added, because of that interest, we just added special urban forest kind of, instead of these 1-by-1 pieces, we actually focused on the 200 urban areas in Eastern US to provide specific lists for them. If that's not up on the website yet, it will be in the next week or two, because I know Matt Peters ran all 180 of those tables, so so I can get you those if you're interested.
Yeah, that's good, really good to know. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up the urban thing. I really think that plays a large role in this, of course, but in any time we talk about habitat management, wildlife management, preserving plant diversity, our urban areas, they can play such a huge role in that. So, all right, well, I think we've gotten through all of our questions. So we're gonna wrap this up. So if you're here for continuing education